Welcome back. One of the things that's come up in some of my conversations in the last few weeks with founders is how to manage performance during this COVID crisis, where people are isolated at home, where there maybe has been some shift in their productivity. How do we address that without being insensitive if we don't know the full picture? Managing performance during COVID, coronation, or are your employees really struggling? Although we're using this to talk about COVID, I think one of the things that's really important is when you see any sort of shift in an employee's performance, this is applicable to that situation as well. We see this a lot in athletics. We see athletes that plateau and then sometimes drop because they've got something going on in their personal life or something going on behind the scenes, and they haven't really developed that athletic maturity yet to kind of manage their whole world at the same time. It's part of what college is about, trial and error. So as you're working with new people within your organization, or even when new people are up against new challenges, whether it's relationships or families or things like the COVID virus, sometimes people are affected in different ways. So we're going to talk about how to manage a performance without being insensitive and, really trying to encompass the whole person. So as a leader, as we're starting to shift and think about work-life balance during this time of COVID, one of the things that I want you to reflect on is your traditional model, what your company looked like and how your company operated before the pandemic and how they're operating now. So what's important to you versus what's actually realistic for an employee during a COVID bound time. So hours per week, 9 to 5, was that the traditional schedule? And were we more focused on project task completion, or were we really focused on that punching in, punching out hourly time? And how can we be flexible within this hours per week model and also this task project completion? How can we bring these two together to create maximum flexibility for our employees that are potentially balancing alternating work schedules, two people in a household that are working full time, that are trying to manage phone calls and things of that nature without enough space to actually work, or have families or are caregivers. So all of those things we really need to reflect on as we're trying to think about these conversations about coronavirus and productivity. So as we get ready to have our check-in time with our employees, I really want us to think about using a question-based approach to starting this conversation about performance. Before we actually give feedback on what's going on with their performance or what we're recognizing, I think it's really important to take a second as leaders and really collect a little bit more information. Now that we're a little farther into the pandemic, this maybe doesn't affect our European countries as much, but for our US founders, we really are looking at a long stretch of people working from home and not coming into the office quite as much. So let's take a look. We want to think about using questions to find answers. So some of the questions that I've come up with that I feel are relevant to the environment and to figuring out what's actually occurring is asking your employees what's easier about working from home. For some people, working from home is way easier than the office, but we want to find out why. What is it about the home environment that's much more conducive to work than the office environment? And this is going to vary for everyone. And then what's harder about working from home? And once again, this is going to vary wildly for everyone. And asking them why, really digging in on these questions, taking notes, and really listening to what they have to say. And then what hours are the best for you in regards to getting your work done versus what tasks are easier for you at home. One of the things that's been really interesting in a couple of conversations that I've had with founders is that they've discovered that some of their employees are much better at specific things at home, and other people are much better at different things at home. So they're starting to contemplate some shifts in roles because of people's strengths and weaknesses in this new working environment. So then asking people, what's harder for you to do at home and why? So now, as a leader, now that we've looked back on these questions, we've asked them, we've listened, we've taken some notes, we can either reflect in the moment or we can end the conversation and come back to the performance expectations part of it slightly later. But when we are actually taking the time to listen and reflect, we can sort of decide if this was a little bit of a coronication or if we do have an employee that's truly struggling with this change to long-term work from home status. So if it is a coronication, what are some strategies that we can use as leaders to sort of rein that in a little bit? I think restating your expectations of their role, regardless of the setting, is critical. If there have been any shifts to your expectations of their role, it is great to restate those. Set up a follow-up check-in with the individual, or ask them for a weekly report or a wrap-up of their work at the end of the week. That's a great way to check in on accountability. If you really have someone that's truly showing signs of a struggle, one of the things that research has talked about as being really pivotal in this manager-employee work environment or relationship is what is your worst case scenario, and truly talking about that. So when we're talking about worst case scenario, we're talking about worst case scenario for the employee, giving them the space to tell you what is sort of their working and professional and personal limits within this environment. And then asking what the company can do potentially to help this person in this time of transition. We know that it's a long-term transition and there will be a light at the end of the tunnel, but how do we get to the end of that tunnel with an employee that truly is struggling without losing them? And then what can we do to create more flexibility for you? If we're looking at two households that are both working and needing workspace within the home, is there a way to open the office to this individual so that they can actually leave the home environment and come into the office a couple of days a week and get that separation of space that they might actually need, whether they've got a dual working family or if they've got a caregiving environment? Sometimes actually being able to leave that environment and come into the office, although not required, could create a space for them to feel like they have a little bit of separation and can get away from things in their life. So this corona pandemic is really an opportunity for us to make some leadership decisions and to really reflect on what being a good leader means. One of the common phrases in business is that people don't leave jobs, they leave managers or they leave bosses. And one of the things that we have found is that really open communication and open information leads to trust. And trust is one of those key factors into keeping employees. And so even though we're afraid to talk about the things that our employees are struggling with the most, when we get that elephant out of the room and we actually do talk about it, it does help create this trust with the leader. And it also takes a little bit of stress off of the employee, understanding that they have given forward their worst case scenario. If someone's able to tell you their worst case scenario, they may not have that trust level built up with you enough to be honest with you at this point, but at least you'll be able to get some read as to where they are and what's happening for them. But as we're starting to craft these leadership decisions, once you've had these conversations with your employees, whether they're a little bit of a coronication or a true struggle or somewhere in between, it's a really good opportunity for you. It's a really good defining moment, a cultural moment for you and your company to really think about what's the most important thing for you as we look down at least another 4 to 6 months of working in true isolation. What's your cultural ideology for your company? And let's go back to it when we're making decisions on how to evaluate people's performance during this time. should, after we know whether it's a little chronication or a true struggle, does that change how we're going to evaluate people? So really looking at your cultural ideology to help guide the way you're going to put down your performance management at this time. And consider being more flexible with people that truly are struggling. How can you support people that are struggling and still hold them to a standard? And maybe that's a conversation that you actually have with the employee, that you're not actually having just in isolation by yourself, but saying to them, this is the level of work that we need. How can I help you get there? How can we get back to that level of performance? Or is that going to be possible? And then why? Why should you as a company support these people that are struggling? I always think that this is a really important time to go back to why you hired them. So when you hired them, there was something about them that you loved. There was something about them that really drew you to them and drew them to you. Is that still within this individual? And can we adjust a few things to help find that again if they truly are struggling? And then create your game plan, you the leader. After you've had these conversations with individuals, decide what's the best course moving forward. And if you're truly struggling with this with a couple of your employees, I would be more than happy to talk through this kind of game plan strategization part with you. And then be honest with yourself and with the employee about best and worst case scenarios. When you get to that point and you're having these tough conversations, once again, the one thing that your employee is going to appreciate the most and something that's going to take a lot of stress off of them is just really understanding what your expectations are in this time of change. And so if your best case scenario is a little bit of shift for them, or even if your worst case scenario is a lot of shift for them, at least you're giving them the opportunity to make their own decisions about being able to create those shifts in order to meet your expectations. So this is definitely a dense and very deep topic, and it's very different for each individual company. Some companies are literally leaving office spaces and going full-time online, but we still need to think about how that full-time online and that fully remote shift changes expectations and how we're going to manage performance. Looking forward to catching up with you soon.